Did you know that Moses, one of the most iconic leaders in biblical history, made a bold request to God that challenged everything we know about faith and sacrifice? He begged for his name to be erased from the book of life in an unprecedented act of love and intercession. But what could have led Moses to make such a radical statement? And what does this have to do with a story of idolatry, betrayal, and redemption in the middle of the desert? Today, you will uncover surprising secrets about Moses that most people have never heard before. Get ready to dive into a story full of twists and profound lessons that can transform how you see your own spiritual journey. Let's dive into the first surprising story about Moses. Imagine the scene. Moses is on Mount Sinai, in direct connection with God, receiving the Ten Commandments, the greatest symbol of the covenant between God and his people. Meanwhile, at the foot of the mountain, chaos is taking over. The people of Israel, impatient with Moses' delay, commit one of the most emblematic acts of disobedience in the entire Bible, the creation of the golden calf. This episode was not just a moment of collective impatience, but a direct betrayal of the covenant that God had just established. With their own hands, the people melted gold jewelry to create an idol, a god made by themselves, breaking the first commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me." This act reveals something profound about human nature, the tendency to seek shortcuts when faith is put to the test. And what does Moses do upon descending from Mount Sinai? He not only witnesses idolatry in its rawest form, but, in an act of indignation and sorrow, breaks the tablets containing the Ten Commandments. This gesture was not just an expression of anger but a visual declaration of what the people had done. They had broken the covenant with God even before it was formalized. But what happens next is even more profound. Moses, despite his indignation, assumes the role of intercessor for the people. He climbs the mountain again and makes a plea that leaves us speechless: "Forgive their sin, but if not, blot me out of the book you have written." Moses was willing to sacrifice his own eternity in exchange for forgiveness for the people. Can you imagine the intensity of that moment? A leader so committed to those he leads, even when they make such grave mistakes. And what was God's response? God rejected Moses' proposal, but also showed mercy. He declared that each person would be responsible for their own sins, but would not abandon the people of Israel. God reaffirmed his promise to lead them to the promised land, but with a warning: the consequences of their mistakes would still be faced. This story teaches us something incredibly relevant today. How many times in our own lives do impatience or fear lead us to seek quick and often wrong solutions? Like the people of Israel, we often forget God's greater promises, trading them for fleeting things. And if you think you already know every detail of this story, keep watching because there's much more about Moses that will surprise you. We still have impactful revelations about other decisive moments in his life that you can't miss. Now that we understand the depth of Moses' sacrifice in the episode of the golden calf, let's explore another fascinating story that reveals a lesser-known side of this great leader. Did you know there was a moment when God wanted to take Moses' life? That's right. The scene is tense and intriguing. Moses had just received a divine mission to liberate the people of Israel from Egypt. But on the way, something unexpected happens. The text in Exodus tells us that God met Moses and sought to kill him. It sounds contradictory, doesn't it? After all, why would God threaten the life of the one he had chosen as a deliverer? The answer lies in a detail that can be easily overlooked. Moses had not circumcised his son, an act symbolizing the covenant between God and the people of Israel. This seemingly simple negligence was, in fact, a reflection of something greater. Moses, as God's chosen leader, needed to align himself with the principles and commandments he was to teach. And here is where Zipporah, Moses' wife, steps in. In a swift and decisive act, she performs the circumcision on their son, saving Moses' life. This story reminds us of how seriously God takes his purpose and his commandments. More than that, it shows us that even the strongest leaders can have moments of failure, but through obedience and correction, they continue on the journey God has prepared for them. This episode is a powerful reminder that before becoming leaders or examples for others, we need to adjust our own lives. Moses had to correct this issue to move forward and fulfill God's greater calling. This leads us to another equally fascinating story about Moses, his relationship with the Promised Land. Imagine spending years leading a people, facing immense challenges, hearing constant complaints, and still remaining faithful to the mission. Now, imagine being told that you would not enter the land you fought so hard for. It seems unfair, doesn't it? But that is exactly what happened to Moses. The reason? An act of disobedience. In the book of Numbers, we see that God instructed Moses to speak to a rock so that water would flow from it, a miracle that would quench the people's thirst. But Moses, frustrated by the people's constant complaints and rebellion, chose to strike the rock with his staff, disobeying God's command. This act, which may seem insignificant to many, carried enormous symbolic weight. The rock represented Christ, and speaking to it symbolized God's grace and provision. By striking the rock, Moses altered the message God intended to convey. Because of this, God decided that Moses would see the promised land from afar but not enter it. Here we learn a valuable lesson: our actions, no matter how small they seem, can have significant consequences when we are part of a greater purpose. Moses teaches us that obedience to God is non-negotiable, even when we are exhausted or frustrated. But before you jump to conclusions, keep watching because there is still much more about Moses that will surprise you. This story is just beginning, and the next moments are even more revealing. And now we arrive at another fascinating chapter in the life of Moses. Let's talk about one of the most mysterious and powerful moments of his journey, the transfiguration of Jesus, where Moses makes a surprising appearance. Imagine the scene: Jesus takes 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, to a high mountain. There, before their eyes, Jesus is transfigured, his face shining like the sun, and his clothes becoming as white as the light. It is a moment of divine glory, but what truly stands out is who appears beside Jesus: Moses and Elijah, 2 of the greatest figures of the Old Testament. What was Moses doing there, centuries after his death? This event demonstrates that Moses represented the law, while Elijah symbolized the prophets. Both were present to testify to the authority of Jesus as the fulfillment of the law and the prophecies. This moment is not just a powerful scene, but also a message for all of us. It reminds us that God works in complete cycles. Moses, who led the people to the edge of the promised land, now appears beside Jesus, who came to open the path to the ultimate promise, salvation. And here is a curious detail that might have gone unnoticed: Moses, who was not allowed to enter the promised land during his lifetime, appears in the promised land during the transfiguration. Isn't that incredible? It's as if God was showing that his promises may take time, but they never fail. Moses had to wait, but at the right time, he was there in the presence of Jesus. Furthermore, this event reveals something essential about Moses' relationship with God. Despite his flaws and humanity, Moses continued to be a powerful instrument of God, proving that he uses imperfect people to fulfill his perfect plans. Speaking of impactful moments, let's turn to another high point in Moses' story: his death and burial. Unlike any other figure in the Bible, Moses was buried by God himself. That's right. Deuteronomy tells us that no one knows the location of Moses' grave, and there is a reason for that. If the location were known, it would likely have become a site of idolatry, something that went against everything Moses preached during his life. What makes this moment even more special is that, even at 120 years old, Moses was in full physical vigor. He climbed Mount Nebo, had a vision of the promised land, and then God called him to himself. A fitting end for someone who lived entirely to fulfill God's purpose. These stories show us that, even amid challenges and failures, God's faithfulness is constant. Moses leaves us an example of perseverance, obedience, and faith, even when we don't fully understand God's ways. Let's continue diving into Moses' incredible stories. One of the most intriguing is about the mysterious dispute over his body. Did you know that after Moses' death, there was a celestial confrontation over his body? That's right. In the book of Jude, verse 9, we read that Michael the archangel had to contend with Satan over Moses' body. But why would Satan want Moses' body? Many scholars believe that if Moses' body had been found, it could have become an object of idolatry among the Israelites. After all, Moses was regarded as one of the greatest spiritual leaders of all time. In his wisdom, God not only buried Moses in an unknown location but also ensured that Satan could not use this to lead the people away from their true focus, worshipping God. This episode reminds us that God always has a perfect plan and protects those who fulfill his purpose. Even after his death, Moses remained a fundamental part of God's divine plan. Now, let's move on to another remarkable point: Moses' unique leadership. He was not just a prophet, he was a legislator, deliverer, and mediator between God and men. Moses interceded countless times for the people of Israel, even when they gravely sinned. One example is his intercession after the golden calf episode, where he pleaded for mercy and asked God to forgive the people. Moses understood that his mission was not just to guide Israel to the promised land, but also to help the people grasp God's holiness and grace. Speaking of holiness, let's recall another powerful moment in Moses' life, his encounter with God on Mount Sinai, where he asked to see God's glory. God responded by showing his goodness and proclaiming his name, but made it clear that no one could see his face and live. Even so, the limited glimpse Moses had of God's glory was enough to transform his face, which shone so brightly that it had to be covered with a veil. This encounter symbolizes something greater: the closer we draw to God, the more we are transformed by his presence. Moses teaches us that true intimacy with God is the greatest reward of a life dedicated to faith. Now we come to the conclusion of this incredible journey. Despite his flaws, Moses was one of the greatest leaders in biblical history. His life teaches us lessons of perseverance, humility, and trust in God, even in the face of the most challenging circumstances. He shows us that God uses imperfect people to accomplish perfect purposes, and that obedience is essential for anyone who wants to fulfill their divine calling. And before we wrap up, I invite you to reflect: what inspires you most about Moses' life? Is it his courage? His faith? Or perhaps his humility? Leave your comment, I'd love to know. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell to receive all updates. Oh, and don't leave just yet. There's another incredible video waiting for you here on the channel. Just click on the screen right now. Thank you for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next video. May God bless you. See you soon.